Figure 1.1, Pierce and Amato's three-dimensional taxonomy of helping situations. So it's a cube, and the y-axis is serious on the positive side and not serious on the negative side. The x-axis is spontaneous and formal on the positive side and planned and formal on the negative side. And on the z-axis, on the positive side is indirect, and on the negative side is direct. I don't think it matters whether it's positive or negative, so basically the three continuums are serious to not serious, indirect to direct, and planned and formal to spontaneous informal. In the preceding definitions that have tried to differentiate between helping and altruism, the major focus has been on the act of providing assistance and the consequences of the behavior for the helper. See Daniel Batson, 1991-1998, however, proposed an alternative point of view that has been quite influential among social psychologists who study prosocial actions. He argued that we should concentrate on the motivation for the act rather than on its consequences when trying to draw these distinctions. He claims the important contrast is between helping that is motivated by egoistic concerns, e.g., if I help that person, it will make me feel good and look good to others, and helping that is motivated by altruistic concerns, e.g., I want to help this victim avoid further suffering. This distinction actually has its roots in early work by Auguste Comte, 1851, who first coined the term altruism to contrast it with egoistic helping. For Batson, altruism refers not to the prosocial act per se, but to the underlying reason for the act. Altruism is a motivational state with the ultimate goal of increasing another's welfare. Of course, as outsiders, we cannot directly observe or measure a person's motivational state. As a consequence, it is often very difficult to determine if an act of helping is truly altruistic. For example, when a person races into a burning building to rescue someone trapped inside, is that person primarily motivated altruistically by his or her concern for the welfare of those who might remain in the building, or egoistically by his or her desire to curry favor and praise with this heroic act, or alternatively, to avoid a sense of guilt if nothing was done? Batson did not deny the existence of egoistically motivated helping, but he offered significant empirical support for his argument that there are certain instances, particularly when a potential helper feels empathic concern for the person in need, in which the primary motive for providing help is to improve the state of another. Even if the helper does receive some social or material reward for providing assistance, as long as the helper's primary intention was to help the other person, Batson argued that this act should be considered altruistic. Batson conducted a number of impressive experiments, the results of which appear to support his theoretical position on the existence of altruism. However, not everyone agrees with Batson's interpretations of his findings, e.g., Cialdini, Brown, Lewis, Luce, and Newberg, 1997. This has been the subject of a long and lively debate, to which we return in Chapter 4. Other disciplines have still other definitions of altruism. Economists, for example, define altruism in terms of the value of an act for the recipient, and more specifically of the cost of the action for the donor. Biologists and ethologists view altruism in terms of the contribution that an action makes to the survival of some group's gene pool, which is sometimes referred to as inclusive fitness. More specifically, according to these scientists, an altruistic behavior is one that increases the likelihood that an altruist's close genetic relatives will survive and reproduce, and thus pass their genes on to successive generations. Dawkins, 1984. Note that for the biologist, an individual helper's motivational concerns and intentions are essentially irrelevant. Indeed, so-called evolutionary altruism, e.g., a bee sacrificing its life to protect the hive, occurs without any thought or awareness. Given the divergent views of what constitutes an altruistic action and the numerous definitions of altruism that have been offered, we are not prepared to select the one correct way of defining it. Others faced this problem as well. For example, Sober and Wilson, 1998, simply used two different labels, i.e., psychological altruism and evolutionary altruism, as their solution to the dilemma. As a result, there may appear to be some inconsistencies across the chapters in how we use the word altruism, depending on the context within which we are using it, but at a minimum, when we use the word altruism, we are referring to a helpful act that is carried out in the absence of obvious and tangible rewards for the helper. Sometimes we go beyond this rather minimalistic definition and specifically discuss the motivations, intentions, and consequences for the helper. As we noted before, we recognize that all prosocial acts are not created equal, and that the intentions and motives of helpers may be the critical criteria for distinguishing between the various forms of helping that we discuss. But there are places in the book where we are not able to make these distinctions because we are not completely sure of how to characterize a particular prosocial action. As we just told you, in something as complex and multifaceted as helping, some amount of ambiguity and inconsistency is unavoidable. It is important to recognize, however, that we do not see helping and altruism as being synonymous. All acts of altruism are acts of helping, but all helping is not necessarily altruism. Cooperation. Helping and altruism refer primarily to situations in which one person or group provides aid to another or others in need, but there are times when people come together to work together toward a common goal that will be beneficial to all concerned. Michael Argyle, 1991, defined cooperation in the broad perspective of social life. Acting together in a coordinated way at work, leisure, or in social relationships, in the pursuit of shared goals, the enjoyment of the joint activity, or simply furthering the relationship. This definition may be somewhat reminiscent of the philosophical discussion of utopian societies and communal living. Argyle further identified three ways in which individuals may cooperate with one another: cooperation for material rewards, communal relationships, and coordination. Kahn, 1986, in his critical appraisal of what he sees as our competitive society, defined cooperation as an arrangement that is not merely non-competitive, but requires us to work together in order to achieve our goals. Kahn, 1990, saw cooperation as a humanizing experience that transcends egocentric and objectifying postures, encourages trust, sensitivity, open communication, and ultimately prosocial activity. Because cooperators can reasonably expect that they will mutually benefit to some degree from their joint efforts, cooperation is a specific kind of prosocial behavior. Cooperation thus differs from the unilateral kinds of helping that we have discussed thus far. The primary difference is that, with cooperation, all those involved in the exchange contribute in one way or another to the group's outcome, as partners sharing in the group's attempt to achieve some common goal. In helping relationships, the two parties are typically not equal partners, with one entity, a person or group, being in need of assistance, and the other entity, a person or group, possessing the resources to respond to their needs. Indeed, in some other instances, the two parties in a helping relationship may be driven apart by the interaction and have differing and perhaps even diametrically opposing goals. For example, the benefactor may be perceived as assuming a position of power over the recipient, who may then feel a sense of indebtedness. Nadler, 1991. As a consequence, the recipient's sense of obligation to the helper may strain the relationship. In cooperative exchanges, however, because of the absence of a power hierarchy and the realization of common rewards, greater group cohesiveness and more positive interpersonal relations usually occur. Just as helping researchers have discovered that there may be both egoistic and altruistic motivations when a person decides to help another, the situations in which cooperation has been studied are often constructed so that different motives of the individuals involved come in conflict with one another. Consider the following situation. The hot water heater in your apartment provides just enough hot water for you and your roommates to each take a quick shower in the morning. You really enjoy letting the hot water beat down on you, but you also realize that your roommates would have to take cold showers if you indulged yourself. What would you do? For that matter, what would Machiavelli or Hobbes or Rousseau or Ayn Rand do? The answer to this question, and the study of cooperative and competitive strategies in this kind of situation, is also part of understanding prosocial behavior. We discuss this issue in Chapter 8 when we discuss social dilemmas, in which one's personal best outcome is at odds with the best collective outcome. Our view of prosocial behavior. The study of prosocial behavior remains full of unsolved problems and unanswered questions. It is interesting that Latané and Darley's 1970 book, reporting the work that sparked so much interest in the area of prosocial behavior, had a question as its title, "The Unresponsive Bystander, Why Doesn't He Help?" Later, Batson, 1991, titled his book on this topic, "The Altruism Question." Many questions about prosocial behavior remain to be asked and remain to be answered, and our goal for the remainder of this book is to delve deeply into this most intriguing aspect of social relations. For example, although Latané and Darley and the public at large were shocked, surprised, and even outraged that people were reluctant to come to the aid of Miss Genovese, was there really any good reason why we ought to expect someone to provide aid to a perfect stranger? What would make a person willing to get involved in a potentially dangerous emergency situation, or to give time or money to some charitable cause for which she will receive little or no benefit? Is there something about a person, some personal characteristic perhaps, that makes that person more inclined to give help or to cooperate with others? If there is some personal characteristic related to a tendency to help, is that tendency due to some inborn genetic endowment that makes helping a part of the human condition, or has the person simply learned to be helpful in the same way that people learn many other social behaviors? And what about the people who are in need of help? Are there certain circumstances in which people confronted with problems will try to solve their own problems instead of asking for assistance from someone else? These kinds of questions illustrate the broad issues that confront social psychologists and other scientists in their efforts to understand more fully the nature of prosocial behavior. We use these questions, and many others, to guide our exploration of this intriguing field of investigation. Chapters 2 through 8 of this book begin with one or more of these questions about some aspect of prosocial action. Using the introductory question as our starting point, we then consider the research findings as they pertain to this question. Rather than simply describing a series of research studies, we present the basic concepts and principles that have been identified. We conclude each chapter with a summary and an answer to the introductory question. Here are brief synopses of each of the chapters of the book and the questions asked in each of them. In Chapter 2, we explore reasons for the seeming pervasiveness of prosocial behavior among human beings and the claim made by some, e.g. Hunt, 1990, that humans are compassionate beasts. Specifically, we consider the evidence for a genetic basis for prosocial tendencies and seek to understand the processes and mechanisms that are responsible for such tendencies. To answer questions about genetic predispositions for prosocial behavior, we present concepts from behavioral genetics and evolutionary theory, including evolutionary psychology and neuroscience, in an attempt to explain why humans seem so predisposed to prosocial. For example, we discuss the biological mechanisms and social processes that may be responsible for humans' remarkable tendency to empathize with others in need. Although we often think of survival of the fittest as meaning that the strongest, fastest, and perhaps smartest will win out, our analysis and review suggest that being the nicest might also be included in the listing of who is the fittest in some cases. The focus of interest in Chapter 3 is on how bystanders react when they see a person in distress. This is the question, raised by Kitty Genovese's murder, that first generated interest in the study of helping behavior. Because the bystanders in that situation were passive, Bibb Latané and John Darley initially asked the question of why bystanders do not help. We ask substantially revised versions of the question, when will a bystander help, and what conditions lead a bystander to offer help to a person in need. More specifically, Chapter 3 explores how the context or situation affects a bystander's decision of whether or not to offer short-term, spontaneous help in an emergency. To answer these questions, we introduce a model of how people make decisions about helping, and we complement this model with a discussion of how the costs and rewards associated with helping affect the actions a bystander takes. Chapter 4 also focuses on bystander intervention and short-term helping, but Chapter 3 asked when will people help, whereas Chapter 4 asks the question, why do bystanders decide to intervene on another person's behalf? That is, we address the factors that motivate a bystander to offer help. What purpose does helping play, and what function does helping serve for the helper? Although we typically assume that benefiting the person in need drives our prosocial behavior, that is, altruistic motives, we argue that benefit for the helper, i.e., egoistic motives, can often be the major motive for helping. We review theories concerned with the roles played by learning experiences, moods and emotions, social norms, and one's personal and social identity in motivating one person to help another. For historic reasons, social scientists began their study of prosocial behavior with bystander intervention. However, emergency intervention is a rather uncommon helping opportunity in most people's lives. In Chapter 5, we turn to more recent research that focuses on long-term helping. Such long-term helping is typically more planful, that is, more thought and consideration are given not only to the question of whether to help, but also to the matter of how best to help over the long run. We start our consideration of this work by discussing how community activists may first identify a helping need and thereby stimulate the development of groups and organizations to respond to those needs. We then examine in some detail the processes that lead people to volunteer, to contribute their time, money, and effort, with some particular attention paid to blood donation as a special case of volunteering. We also consider prosocial behavior within organizational and industrial settings, and how organizational citizenship and, in some cases, whistleblowing about organizational problems can have beneficial results. Chapter 6 is again concerned with the origins of prosocial behaviors in humans, but in this chapter we approach the issue from a more traditional developmental psychology perspective, and much less from the biological or genetic perspective that we took in Chapter 2. There are 3 broad questions around which the chapter is organized. How do helping and other prosocial behaviors change as people mature? What are the processes that are responsible for these developmental changes that influence a variety of prosocial behaviors? And how do these processes subsequently affect the behaviors of adults? To answer these questions, we investigate age-related changes in the factors that motivate people to help, the way people think about helping, and how people engage in helpful and altruistic behaviors. We then discuss the kinds of cognitive development and learning experiences that appear to be responsible for these changes, and conclude with a brief consideration of how developmental processes affect prosocial behavior in adults, including gender differences in helping. In Chapter 7, our focus turns from prosocial actions per se to the people who perform the prosocial act and to the people who are the recipients of these actions. Human nature and situational factors play important roles in determining if and when help will be given, but important individual differences exist among people in terms of how likely a person is to be helpful. Therefore, we examine when and how certain personality traits and other personal attributes are related to different kinds of prosocial actions, and we then look at the consequences of being helpful for the person who helps. Finally, we consider helping from the perspective of the person who needs assistance. People with problems do not invariably seek help or even accept it when it is offered. Therefore, We explore the circumstances that either lead people to seek help or inhibit them from asking for assistance, and then examine the impact of receiving assistance on the recipient of help. Chapter 8 represents something of a change in our approach to the study of prosocial behaviors. Although most of the preceding chapters have focused on prosocial actions between a single benefactor and some individual or group in need, this chapter explores prosocial actions between two or more people who have come together for mutual benefits through cooperation. We first consider the many factors that contribute to cooperative behavior among members of a group who can expect positive outcomes by sharing assets and perhaps sacrificing for one another so that everyone will win. We see how the processes that facilitate helping and volunteering translate into prosocial acts of cooperation, and then we explore new, emergent processes that seem only to operate on prosocial behavior in group settings. We conclude by extending our consideration of cooperation within groups to the study of cooperative behavior between groups, and by so doing, we find that many of the factors that break down prejudice and discrimination between groups also serve to promote greater intergroup cooperation. Chapter 9, the final chapter, is divided into 3 distinct sections relating to the past, present, and future of research on prosocial behavior. In the first section, about the past, we review how work on prosocial behavior has developed. In the second section, about the present, we summarize the answers to many of the questions we asked in each of the chapters and propose some theoretical models that attempt to integrate what we believe we know about prosocial action. In the third section, which focuses on the future, we propose a multi-level approach to the study of prosocial behavior, suggesting that prosocial behavior would be best understood by considering it from 3 interrelated perspectives: intra-individual processes, micro-level processes, such as biological mechanisms, interpersonal processes, meso-level processes, such as the relationship between the helper and recipient, and intra- and intergroup processes, macro-level processes, such as helping and cooperation within and between groups. Using this multi-level perspective as a framework, we suggest promising new avenues of inquiry. In addition, throughout Chapter 9, we seek a little help from our friends and report what other researchers in the field of prosocial behavior see as the important research areas and questions for the future. This final chapter contains what we know about helping, altruism, and cooperation, and what we do not know but believe we need to learn. The exciting prospect for us is that there seem to be so many new areas to study and questions to ask, but let us begin with what we know.